This is Shashikla of Litrial for its third episode of Essential Reads, which brings in a kind of conversation with celebrity writers. And today, we have amidst us the Britain's female Stephen King, C.J. Tudor. She is the author of The Burning Girls, The Other People, The Hiding Place, and The Chalkman, which won the International Thriller Writers Award for Best First Novel and the Strand Magazine Award for Best Debut Novel. Welcome, CJ.
Hello. Hiya. Thanks for having me.
How do you do?
I'm doing all right, actually. I'm not too bad, thank you.
It's really nice to have you amidst us for Litrial today.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me to have a chat.
That's nice. CJ, can you give us and the brief audience a brief introduction about yourself, the journey as a writer? That would be a great start, I believe.
Okay, well, I mean, I think like a lot of authors, it took me a long time to get published. I'd always wanted to write. I used to write when I was very small, and I loved writing. My English teacher once wrote on one of my essays that if I did not become Prime Minister or a best-selling author, he'd be very disappointed. But that didn't happen right away, neither of those. It took me, I left school at 16, actually. I didn't take any writing courses. I didn't actually go to college or university. I just sort of wanted to get out there. And I was quite lucky because I sort of had a job on a local newspaper, and then I worked in advertising. So there were things that I was writing, but I wasn't writing books and fiction, which is what I really wanted to do. But like most people, I had to find jobs that kind of paid the bills because, you know, writing a book takes time and you need to support yourself while you're doing that. So I sort of sought out writing jobs. And, you know, I liked doing that. I had a variety of jobs. For a short period of time, I worked as a television presenter. As I say, I worked in advertising. I did voiceovers for commercials. And actually, when I wrote The Chalkman, which was my debut novel, I was running a dog walking business. So I kind of a varied career. But I always, at the back of it, I always wanted to write. And I was writing. I wrote short stories, and I got some of those published in magazines. You know, and I tried to get published. I think I got to my 30s and thought, if I really am serious about this, firstly, I have to finish something. And that's what I always say to all people who ask for writing advice, what's the most important advice? And it's like, finish something. Because it's actually, it sounds simple, but it's the hardest thing to do, because there will come a point in every book where you hate it and it's hard and you think it's rubbish and you've probably got another idea that you think is better and will be easier. And it's so easy to put that aside. And that's what I used to do a lot. I'd get maybe a quarter or halfway through a book and just go, no, this isn't any good. I'll write something else. And I never finished anything. So sort of in my sort of early 30s, I thought I have to finish something. And so I sort of forced myself to get to the end of a book. And it actually wasn't very good when I finished it. I don't think any amount of editing would have saved it. But I'd kind of proved that I could get to the end of something. And that was a big boost to me to know that I could write, a 500-page book. I did have it in me to do it. And so I sort of set about trying to get better, which is what I think a lot of writers have to do. You can have the raw kind of talent, you can have that ability to tell stories, but there's a lot of honing that goes on in the structure of books and how you put it together and chapters. And I think I had to learn that a bit more. And in my mid-30s, I did get an agent. But I learned a very important lesson that it's lovely to get an agent, but it has to be the right agent. And obviously you need an agent to get published. And this agent was a great agent, but they weren't the right agent for me, because they represented a lot of authors that wrote procedural crime, sort of cop crime, police detectives, and very sort of straight, what I call straight crime. Whereas yes, I always wanted to go a bit Stephen King. I like to make things a bit creepier and a bit different. And so they kept trying to cut all that out, and I kept trying to put it in, and we didn't really get anywhere, and we never got near a publisher. And eventually I took, after 2 years of sort of not getting anywhere, I took what was at the time a really difficult decision to leave that agent and kind of start again, kind of go it alone. And I wasn't sure if it was a brave thing I did or a stupid thing I did at the time, because it's very hard to get an agent. It's hard to get published. But I did, and I sort of decided I wanted to write what I loved. That particular agent told me that what I wanted to write, which is kind of a mix of mystery, thriller, and maybe a little bit of horror, supernatural, wasn't publishable. No publisher would want it, I was told. But I wanted to write that. So I kept on working on my writing, kept on getting a few short stories published. And then I suppose the thing I've learned is that getting published is a mixture of having an ability to write and having a good idea, but there's also a lot of luck and timing in it. You could write a book and one year it wouldn't be what the publishers were looking for, and the next year maybe it is. And in between sort of everything else, I had my daughter. And I did get to a point actually where I thought maybe I'm not going to get published, because I was so short of time. I was being a mum, I was running a business. And then for my daughter's second birthday, some friends of ours bought her a tub of coloured chalks. And she wanted to go outside like, children do, like we perhaps all done as children, and draw on the pavement, draw on the driveway. So we took these chalks outside, and she wanted me to draw stick men, lots of stick men. And we covered the driveway in these different coloured stick men doing different things, and then went inside and kind of forgot about it. And then later that night, I opened the back door because we had to let the dog out, and we were all going to bed, and the security light came on. It illuminated all these stick men all over the driveway. And in the darkness, and because I'd forgotten they were there, they really made me jump. They looked incredibly sinister, like they just appeared. And I remember calling to my husband and saying, these chalk men look really creepy in the dark. And it was one of those light bulb moments. It was the idea, the chalk men. It just seemed like a good title, like an idea, like there was something in it. And very quickly, I sort of started to write this book that basically featured this gang of children who invent this childhood game using these stick figures and chalk drawings to pass messages in their small hometown. And then it becomes sinister because these chalk figures start appearing on their own around the scenes of terrible things that have happened. And that idea really quickly came to me, and I started writing it. And it gave me the chance to actually do what I'd always wanted to do, which was write a book that featured my love of the 80s when I was a teenager, and all the things I loved in the 80s, Stephen King, films such as, The Goonies and The Lost Boys, but base it in the UK. And so that's really what the Chalk Man became, my sort of homage to all the things I loved as a teenager in the 80s, because the childhood parts are set in the 80s, while the adult parts are set in the present day. And write this kind of UK-based thriller mystery, but with like an element of sort of creepiness in it as well. But I think when I sent it off to an agent, I still didn't sort of think, this is the one, this will get me published. But I think it just happened to be at the right time, because although I hadn't planned it like this, I started writing the book before the TV series. The TV series Stranger Things came out sort of after I'd sort of in between me writing the book and sending it off. And of course that became very popular. And suddenly everybody was very into the 80s again, and that kind of, gangs of kids getting involved in creepy adventures. And my book went out just at that time. And I think that it hit a nerve. And, I was incredibly lucky that, lots of publishers wanted it. So I sort of went from being unpublishable to being published in about 40 countries. And this is what I mean about timing sometimes. I think it was that book at that time. Had I submitted it at another time, maybe, that wouldn't have happened. But it's something you really can't plan. And, and I wrote the book that I loved. And, that was what started everything for me really now. I've just, finished my 4th book. That's just been published. And I'm working on my 5th. And I have contracts to write, I think, up till about book 7 or 8 at the moment. So, it was wonderful. And it did change my life. I'm not sure whether it does for every author, but, for us, money was quite tight. Time was short. We were working hard. And, to have these wonderful publishing deals and suddenly be a published author really did change our lives, changed everything for me. So it's been, a fantastic sort of experience and journey. And I've learned a lot, and I'm still learning a lot about publishing and about being a writer. I still feel like I'm sort of working at it. I don't think it's the sort of thing you do where you ever feel you've got to a stage where you're finished, you're done. I'm sure even Stephen King sits there sometimes and thinks, this book is going to be the best one yet, So that's kind of what's got me where I am, really.
That's a fantastic introduction by CJ. It's not even an ordinary man would feel motivated listening to your words. It's not just a magic that you became a writer. You had a hard life to come across, and that has placed you where you are right now.
And I think you do appreciate it. I know it's a sensitive thing to say, but I'm 49 now, and I wasn't published till I was 46. So I think it was nice to have done all those things before that, and then to really appreciate getting that break sort of later in life, I guess.
Okay. So having done the introduction part, shall we move on to the core of this Essential Reads, the questioning session?
Yes.
Yeah. Horror fiction is not something that soothes. Instead, it is the one which shocks or even frightens the reader. That being the case, what made you choose horror fiction?
I think all of us, in a strange way, kind of like being a bit frightened or a bit scared, but in a safe way. It's like watching a scary film or going on a roller coaster. It's a safe way to be scared. And I think when I was a child, I was scared of everything. And yet I was really, really drawn to creepy stories about ghosts and all those sorts of things. And I used to quite like scaring myself. And I think I picked up a first Stephen King book when I was about 11 or 12. And I just loved it. I just loved how he wrote. I loved, the scariness, the chills. And I just knew this was what I wanted to write. And I think it was as simple as that. It just inspired me. And perhaps in a way, it's a good way of getting your own fears out. You get them out on the paper and you write them yourself. As I say, I was a very scared child. I had lots of night terrors, but I was still drawn to being scared in a strange way. And that's what I've always liked to write. And I think it is perhaps that idea you can get those fears out on the page and maybe make them less scary. But it's a safe way to be scared, I think, in books, because there's normally a resolution and the good guys kind of normally win. And you can shut the book if you want to and walk away from it. So I think we kind of all like that in a way.
So as a child, what scared you? You wanted to scare that. Using that, you wanted to scare all the children almost.
I mean, lots of things scared me. I was scared of the dark. I was scared of sort of monsters under the bed. I used to sleep without, I had to have a ritual. The covers were pulled right up over my head and 2 toys either side. And because that would keep me safe, of course. If the covers are over your head, no monster can possibly get you. I was scared of the wardrobe door being open. I just all the normal childhood fears, I think, really. But I always had a really vivid imagination, which is great now. But I think as a child who sort of could see anything, and I would imagine it at night and be scared by it. But as I say, conversely, I was really attracted to reading spooky ghost stories and things. It was that strange fascination with something, but also, actually being quite scared of stuff a lot of the time. But I think a lot of kids are like that. They are very drawn to things that will spook them and scare them. Kids can be quite dark.
So it's your personal scary episodes that have contributed to your fiction as such.
I think so. I think writers in particular, and I had this conversation with someone else, are a little bit like kids that don't grow up. We're still writing, we're still being those kids in a way, writing out those things that scare us.
Okay, and we came to know that you had worked in the television industry as a presenter. How was the experience? Did it help you anyway in becoming a writer? how would you differentiate both your experiences as a presenter and a writer?
I kind of fell into being a television presenter, and it was only for the period of about sort of 6 months to a year. I just sort of I was lucky I got asked. I didn't really like it. I never wanted to be a presenter. I liked writing. I'm much happier behind the scenes. But it was such a lovely opportunity because it was a show about films, which I love. And it meant that I got to travel and I got to meet movie stars, which, isn't too shabby. And so, I did it more as an experience than anything else. And I enjoyed parts of it. I enjoyed, meeting, movie stars, some of whom were most of whom were really nice. And a couple who weren't so nice. But it was an experience when I was only 22, 23. So, suddenly to be sort of flying around the world to kind of, interview stars and that kind of thing was an amazing experience. But I don't think it really ever fed into my writing at all. It was a very separate thing. But it was just something that, I experienced and I did. But in a strange way, I was also quite glad when it ended because I was never really comfortable in front of the camera. It wasn't what I wanted to do. Some people want to do that, whereas I was like, well, I can kind of sort of do it, but I'm not brilliant at it. But, someone's letting me do it for a bit, so we'll see how it goes.
You say that you are not that comfortable in front of the camera, but you seem to be so comfortable.
Well, I feel like this doesn't really count because it's just kind of like you're just having a conversation. It's not sort of like you're going to be, I don't know, on a television screen or anything. And maybe as well, perhaps you get a bit more comfortable as you get older. I was 22, 23 then, and probably very self-conscious about how I looked, and now I don't really care. So.
Yeah, that really matters, and you look so beautiful even now. Nobody would call you 49. And there are so many writers who write horror fiction. What makes you unique from the rest of the crowd in the world of horror fiction?
Well, I think there's still not that many women that write horror fiction. There are a few, and there's some great women writing horror fiction, but I think it had traditionally been male writers who tended to write horror. Obviously, the writers I grew up with were Stephen King and Dean Koontz and James Herbert and Clive Barker. And that sort of tradition of men writing horror sort of has really continued. And I think it has been, a lot of women write psychological fiction, but there are not as many, I would say, famous women horror writers, even though there are a lot of women working in the genre now who write some cracking books. So, I think for a start, being a woman is sort of something different. And I've been very fortunate that I've been able to write books that have almost taken sort of that slight degree of horror a little bit more mainstream, because it's still sort of regarded as genre fiction. Aside from Stephen King, it's not always the sort of fiction that's in the top 10 or in the supermarkets. That tends to be more your straight psychological fiction, psychological thrillers rather. And I also, I like to set my books in the UK because that's where I'm from. It's what I know. And a lot of, I'd say, the bigger horror writers do tend to be sort of American still, certainly set books in America, which is something I've always resisted doing because, I like writing about where I was born and where I grew up and, and I don't really know America. I've not lived in America. So I tend to write about the small villages and creepy traditions and things that I know in the UK, really. And I suppose, in a way, my books aren't strictly, completely horror. They tend to be what I always say is there's an element of thriller in there. They're mysteries at their heart. There's a mystery to be solved. So if people like, really twisty mystery, that's there. But if you also like a little bit of being creeped out and scared, that is also there. And I try and strike the balance between them both, really.
So generally it is believed that women are scared rather than being scary. But CJ, you have been a really scary person, I believe, in writing horror fiction.
But I'm like the least scary person you could hope to meet as well. I think
maybe you're writing.
Yeah, I mean, I like to sort of try and be scary in my life. I'm not a fan of, and I never have been. I'm not a fan of sort of gore. I'm not a fan of sort of really, you know, graphic descriptions of violence or things like that. I don't like that, and I don't think it's necessary. I'm more the psychological chills and scares. I always say, you know, you can write something that's scary. If anyone has read a lot of Stephen King, they'll know that most of his books aren't hugely graphic. Some of them you wouldn't even really say are scary or horror at all. It's more about what you don't say and about what you don't see sometimes. I think that's quite important in horror. Let the reader use their imagination. You know, you can do some description that's scary, but I think, you know when to stop, because the reader's own imagination will create something far more scary than you can actually describe a lot of the time. So I sort of prefer to sort of that type of scare or chill rather than being overly graphic or gory, because I don't think that's sort of necessary. You can still scare people, like I say, by what you don't say. It's that old thing, isn't it, in the film, that actually not seeing the monster is scarier, because when you see the monster, it's quite often a letdown. It's the build up to that, you know. So that's what I try and do, I think, in the books.
That makes you a real horror writer, maybe. And Daily Mail has described you as Britain's female Stephen King. What is your comment on this comparison? Being a fan of Stephen King, what was your reaction to this comment?
It was amazing. It's the sort of thing that when I was an aspiring writer and I used to walk dogs for a living, traipsing around muddy fields, and I would daydream of, you know, getting a book published and somebody writing something like that. That would have been my daydream, and it's amazing. I mean, it's the ultimate compliment I think you can give to a writer, because Stephen King is a wonderful, not just a wonderful horror writer, but just a wonderful storyteller. And so, you know, to be compared to someone as brilliant and great and prolific as him is a massive compliment. Obviously, I think I've got a very, very long way to go to earn that comparison. But it is lovely to be talked about in the same breath.
And it's almost your dream come true, I believe.
Yeah. I mean, I've read all of his books, and I grew up reading, you know, his books. So, I mean, and it's the same for many writers. I think whatever their genre, quite often, you know, he's one of those writers that so many of us aspire to, because he's so prolific, he's so talented, he's such an incredible storyteller who has such a unique voice. And again, I think that's what, as a writer, you aspire to. You aspire to have your own voice that stands out from the other writers, because, you know, there's a lot of books out there, there's a lot of authors. So I think that's, you know, you want to sort of have that unique feel to your books.
Taking after your role model, getting inspiration from your role model, and you becoming almost one like him is something fantastic. And we are proud of you, CJ.
Thank you.
Getting ideas to write a romance is pretty much simpler and easier than getting ideas for horror fiction. Where do you get your ideas for your horror fiction exactly?
All sorts of things, really. As I say, the first book was inspired by my little girl and the chalk drawings that we did. My second book was inspired by an area where I used to live, because I used to live near a mining village in the north of England. That's where I went to school. And when they closed all the mines in the UK back in the 80s, where the old pits used to be, it was quite desolate. And I always thought, you know, something spooky about the idea of all these abandoned tunnels. And that was really the idea that sparked the hiding place. The Other People was sparked by it tends to be things that happen to me at the start of The Other People. The main character is sort of stuck in slow moving traffic behind this beaten up old car with stickers around the windows, when he sees a face appear in the back of this car window. And you know, it turns out it's his own daughter being, you know, driven away who knows where. And that's kind of the starting point of the book. And that again was from a real life experience. I mean, I didn't actually see my little girl in the back of the car, but I was sat behind this strange beaten up old car in traffic. And I think, like a lot of writers, you know, when your mind wanders, you start thinking, what if? It's almost like what's the worst that could happen? What if a face appeared in the back of this car? What if it was someone I knew? What if it was my own daughter being kidnapped when she should be at home in bed? And I think it's following that idea to its ultimate conclusion. I always say never ask a thriller or horror writer what's the worst that can happen, because they will be able to tell you in precise detail. It's like, right, rolls up sleeves. And my latest book, The Burning Girls, was inspired by the area where we now live. We moved from a city in the north of England to a very rural area in the south 2 years ago. And when we came to look at what is now our house, as we were driving into the village, I noticed this little chapel up a small hill to the left. And something about it, it was very unusual. It wasn't typical of the area. It was just slightly creepy. And straight away I saw it and I was like, I must write a book about that. And that was sort of the inspiration for The Burning Girls. And then I started researching the history of the area. In fact, it had quite a macabre history, which all helped. So it's things you see, it's things people say. Sometimes it's just a phrase or a word that just sits in your head. I'm writing a short story called The Completion at the moment. And that just came about because recently we completed a house sale for my mum. And I started thinking about the phrase completion and how many multiple meanings it could have. It could be something quite creepy. So I think when you're a writer, ideas come from everywhere. It can be the oddest little thing that sparks an idea. And then suddenly you have to write that story, which is great. And long may that continue to happen. Long may the ideas keep coming.
Maybe you pick ideas from reality, but your imagination has a great role to play in molding it in the right form.
Yeah, I think it's where you run with it. It's sort of taking an idea that, it could just be, you could just dismiss it. But I think as a writer, those little sparks are always happening. You're perhaps subconsciously always looking for things and ideas. And then you sort of store them all away.
There are so many challenges that a novelist faces when it comes to writing. What do you think is the greatest challenge in writing a book? And how did you overcome that?
I think it goes back to what I said before about finishing it. That simply is the greatest challenge. And I've realized now that at some point in a book, it varies depending on the author. For me, it's quite often around 150 to 200 pages. You find that you're quite stuck. I'm not a planner. I like to sort of, make my books up as I go along. I don't plot them all out. I start writing and see where I go. And inevitably, I quite often find I get to a point in the book where I'm not quite sure where I'm going, where I'm not quite sure if what I've written is any good. It's that kind of like you hit that bit of a wall. And I find that happen in every book. And I think that can be the point where, again, I quite often have another new idea that I've already thought of when I'm writing a particular book. And there's always the temptation of the shiny new idea, because the shiny new idea for the next book is perfect. You haven't ruined that one yet. You haven't started writing it. Nothing has gone wrong with it. So it can always be so tempting to want to write the shiny new idea when the thing you're currently writing has become difficult. And every book becomes difficult at a stage. I think particularly with thrillers, when you're trying to sort of create mysteries and twists and reveals, and you get to a point where it can be quite hard to work out how you're going to bring it all together. And I always say to people writing books, don't be tempted by the shiny new idea. Get over that hump and finish, what you're writing. Every book is difficult at some point. And you will find if you can get over that hump where you actually hate that book you're writing and you kind of just want it to go away, you will find it all starts to fall into place and you will sort of power through to the end. And also, for me, there's a lot of work in the editing. I'm a great believer in sort of honing the book and spending a lot of time, polishing it. My first draft is really always just a way to get the words on the page, which is something else I quite often say to people. If you are stuck, just write anything. You know what? It doesn't have to be good. It can be rubbish. It doesn't matter if you write 2 chapters that are absolutely rubbish and you're going to go back and probably completely rewrite them or cut them out. But you've got something down and it might help you get to the next bit. And it's the old adage of, you can't edit a blank page. And it's very, very true. If you've got something to work with, you can salvage it and make it work somehow. So I think those are things that I've sort of learnt going along. Because you're constantly learning, and I constantly learn from my editor at my publishing house. And so, with each book, I sort of remember things that she's told me about the previous book. And so each time I'm sort of trying to put those things into practice and get better as a writer. So you mean to say that when you get a shiny idea, you just set it aside and continue the work that you're going on with. But Have you ever brought up that shiny idea again into another novel later when the work has been completed? Yeah, normally the shiny new idea becomes the next book. That sort of works then as something I can look forward to. That's why what I do now, I put it aside and I tell myself that could be the next book. Because quite often the idea for the next book I'll already have while I'm writing my current book. I'm always a couple of ideas ahead. So, for example, the book I'm writing now, which will be book 5, I'm sort of getting to the end of the second draft. But I already know I've already started writing book 6. I have the beginning of book 6 put away, ready to, start as soon as I can. But it's nice to have something to look forward to as well, I think. So, but it's the temptation not to get swayed too much by that idea, because the fact is, the reason it's so tempting is because, you haven't started writing it yet. It hasn't become difficult. So,
out of curiosity, I need to ask another question here. Something which appears to be shiny and attractive in the beginning, if you happen to set it aside after some time, when you just happen to go through that or ponder over it, the shine of it is lost, is it not?
Well, I mean, I sort of, if it's a good idea, it'll stand. I think if it's a good idea or not, if by the time you come to sort of write it or approach it, you don't want to do it. You sort of start to learn which ideas have legs. And, and in downtime, I'll often sort of, even when I'm working on one book, we'll sort of give a little bit of thought to the next one. Mostly I've always known with the other people, I had that idea quite early when I was writing the book before it. And I always write the first chapter of something if I've got an idea. Even if I'm in the middle of another book and I have another, idea I think is good, I will write the first chapter or write a little synopsis. And that way I know if I think that idea's got legs and it will work. But I don't let myself think too much about it, because for me, as I say, I don't plot. So for me, as long as I've just got like a tempting first chapter or a little bit of an outline, I'm quite excited about seeing where it goes. But I don't like to know too much about it myself, because it's about discovering it myself when I write it. So as I say, I don't plot my books out. And for me, that keeps it interesting and exciting. And sometimes it's a nightmare, but
okay. Characters and story are intertwined. Do you come up with characters first or the story part first?
A little bit of both. Mostly it's the idea, it's the story. And then very quickly I'll normally have an idea for the character or the voice. I tend to, as soon as I can't speak. As soon as I have an idea, I do tend to write that first chapter, that opening. I quite often have an opening sort of line. And then very quickly you find the voice you want to write it in. And it's funny how that comes. Sometimes some books are very definitely, straight away it's a first person voice you have in your head and you have to write it like that. Others, it just automatically you find yourself writing in third person, and it feels a very natural process for me. I don't give it too much thought, because I think if you overthink it doesn't work. It has to be that natural finding sort of the voice and the story. And for me, it starts with the story, and then the characters kind of spring into life along the journey, really. And then it all starts to sort of work together. I think with thrillers and mysteries, obviously, you have to keep an eye on the plot. You've got to steer that plot in a certain direction. But it should never be at the expense of your characters. I always think if a character feels like they're doing something that's unnatural or they wouldn't do, the reader will spot that. They'll be like, well, that character wouldn't do that, because they become invested in them. So you've got to sort of stay true to your characters. And sometimes you'll find when you write them that they do take it in a bit of a different direction to you had originally planned. I'm a big fan for sort of, killing people off partway through or having them do something that's unexpected, that, maybe gives the reader a bit of a surprise. So, I think it's a little bit of a mixture of both, really.
That's good. How did you approach creating the characters of Joe and his sister Arnel in The Hiding Place? Did you have any real-time siblings in mind?
No, I mean, I don't actually have any siblings. I'm an only child. Joe was, again, I just had Joe's voice in my head. And I knew when I wrote Joe that he was going to be a character that certainly at the start the people might not like very much, because he's quite a caustic character. He's not a particularly likable guy when you first meet him. But in a way, his little sister Annie is kind of his redemption in a way. We start to learn why he's like that, how he loved his little sister and how he sort of came to be how he is. And it's always quite fun writing dislikable characters, truthfully. Writing characters who are a little bit conflicted and perhaps not that nice is actually generally more fun than writing characters that are nice, because you can have a bit of fun with them. And particularly with Joe, I really loved writing Joe, because he was a very caustic, sarcastic character. So I could have him say things that, I might like to say to someone, but would never actually say. And I could have him say them because he wasn't particularly nice. He didn't mind being rude to people. So he was fun to write. And yet there were other characters in that book that were fun to write as well. As I say, writing the unpleasant characters and the baddies sometimes can be, more fun than writing the good guys, because, there's sort of sometimes more to play with.
The point you have told now here is, I just want to elaborate on that and ask you another question related to it. Developing a protagonist seems to be a much simpler task, for he is an ideal representation of virtues most of the time. As a writer, what is your opinion? Developing a bad character, is it more difficult?
No, I think writing bad characters is fun, but you have to be careful you don't fall into a cliche with them. You want them to have some motivation themselves, and you don't want them just to be some kind of cardboard cutout kind of Hannibal Lecter rip-off, or there's a certain tone that a lot of writers tend to use for example, say your baddie or your serial killer, and it becomes very similar in a lot of books. And it can be very easy to fall into that sort of trap of making a character a cliched baddie. In most of my books, I haven't necessarily had just one evil character, say, the killer, the serial killer or whatever, who's just the one evil character. I'm more interested in sort of the grey areas of normal people's characters, because I think we all have the potential to do evil, to do bad things, as we have the potential to do good things. It's just a case of pressing the right buttons and putting someone in an extreme position. And I'm interested in what, pushes somebody to do a bad thing. Because as I say, I think we're all capable of it, given the right set of circumstances. And I find it interesting to place characters in those positions, to sort of see where they go. So I'm more interested in sort of those complexities of people than a character, writing a character who's just purely a bad character. I like even my bad characters to perhaps have a little bit of a degree of humanity and redemption. But funnily enough, I am in my current book, I do have a kind of serial killer character, and writing that character actually has been more difficult for exactly the reasons I was talking about. That you don't want it to become some kind of cliche, because anyone who's read a lot of thriller books will know there quite often is a certain tone to those characters, and I've been trying very much to avoid that because I don't want it to be a cliche. So again, it depends on the book and it depends on the character. But, writing conflicted characters who aren't wholly good, the most fun characters are those that do bad things but have a bit of humanity and something about them that you actually quite like. Those I think are always interesting to read and write about. That character where they're not a good person, but there's still something about them you kind of like and find fascinating and interesting.
These bad characters, you take much care that you don't find a pattern in them. So you need to work a lot on these bad characters.
Yeah, to make them unique, I think that's it. You don't like I say, as most writers, you don't want to write a cliche. You want to keep the writing fresh, and you want the characters to feel real. So I think that's the trap to avoid falling into sometimes.
So as a writer, you need to know a lot of psychology.
Yes. I sort of wouldn't call myself an expert. I'm somebody who finds people fascinating. I've got no, qualifications or anything in that degree, but I've always been a people watcher. I like watching people. I find people interesting, whether they do good things or bad things. I'm a sort of person that will sort of see people in a cafe and will start to try to imagine their life. Or catch a little bit of conversation, and then again sort of start thinking about it. So yeah, people are interesting, and I like thinking about what makes them tick and do certain things, and I find them endlessly fascinating. And I think that's good. I think it's good to be interested in people. It doesn't mean I always want to be surrounded by people. I'm quite happy being a solitary person as well. But yeah, people are interesting, you know, all ages. I like sort of, I find sort of older people interesting as well. As I'm getting older, you know, more and more, I think that, you know, we should be telling, you know, stories shouldn't always be about young people. We should be telling stories for the older perspective, as the older generation have a lot to give and a lot to tell, and their stories are interesting too. So yeah, people are just fascinating.
Maybe it is the solitary person in you which makes you a very good observer indeed.
Maybe it's because I was an only child. You know, I used to make up a lot. I used to live in a little fantasy world when I was a kid. Every day I would create this fantasy world that I lived in. And so I was always kind of telling stories in my own head. And I had imaginary friends and imaginary sisters and brothers sometimes as well, which was great because they could just cease to exist if they annoyed me, you know, like real brothers and sisters. But, you know, so perhaps that's where it came from, always wanting, sort of watching people, wanting to tell stories about them. And I guess that's perhaps where it started. But I am also quite content in my own company too, to sit back and just sort of watch people. So maybe, you know, it's that only child thing. It's funny because I was speaking to another writer who was also, I think, an only child, and we both had that same experience of growing up in a kind of imaginary world and reading a lot, but also our own sort of imaginary world. So maybe there is an only child thing there somehow.
Reading of your novel, The Chalkman, has made many to spend sleepless nights. What was your experience in writing such a thriller? Did you have sleepless nights too?
Only in terms of making the plot work, I think, probably, or waking up and thinking, oh my God, have I left a big plot hole in it? No, I don't tend to scare myself with my writing because I kind of know what's going to happen. So, you know, it doesn't really creep me out. I can be creeped out, you know, reading other people's books sometimes because it's a different experience. But because I know it's coming out of my own head, it doesn't tend to sort of freak me out. Even when I'm writing really creepy stuff, I'm quite good at sort of disconnecting from it. Only occasionally, perhaps if I'm really involved in it, would something perhaps make me jump if I was particularly involved in a scene. But a lot of the time, you know, because I have my little daughter and well, she's off school at the moment because, you know, we're homeschooling again. I'll be, you know, writing a particularly creepy part of the book and she'll be sat next to me doing some schoolwork. So I sort of, you know, I'm able to have both heads on, I think, really.
Yeah. And criticism contributes much to the growth and betterment of a writer. And especially in the initial stages, a negative criticism would have pulled your spirit down. How have you handled negative criticism in your writing career?
It is hard. I think when you have when my first book came out, and I think as a debut novelist, it's kind of terrifying. One author said to me, and I really identified with it, she said, I want lots of people to go out and buy my book, put it on their bookshelf and never read it. Because as soon as someone reads it, of course, some people aren't going to like it. And that is just a fact, because we all have different tastes and, you know, reading is very subjective. And of course, when your first book comes out, you do want to know what people think about it, obviously. So I used to read reviews on a site called Goodreads and, you know, other reviews that would come in. And, you know, when you get a lovely review, it's amazing. And it's a wonderful thing that someone's read your book and enjoyed it. But inevitably, after a period of time, after a certain number of reviews, you will get somebody who doesn't. You know, you will get that first 1-star review. And it's absolutely devastating. It really hurts. And I think quite often sometimes those reviews sometimes a really horrible review isn't the worst. Sometimes a review that gives 2 or 3 stars but seizes on something perhaps you doubt in your own writing yourself can be the worst. And yeah, it does hurt, I think, particularly when it's your first book. And a lot of people, I think with The Chalkman, a lot of people kind of miss the point with my writing. There's lots of nods to Stephen King books and characters in it because it's very much a homage to Mr. King and all that, you know, they're things I loved as a teenager. And I think a few people were very much like, I was just copying, just ripping off Stephen King, which obviously wasn't my intention. And that hurt because, as I say, it wasn't my intention. It was a bit of a love letter to, you know, Mr. Stephen King and also all the things I loved as a teenager in the 80s. And yeah, most people, you know, understood that. But yeah, criticism is difficult. You do have to develop a thick skin. And I think I learned very quickly after that experience, which, you know, in a way can spoil that first book glow, you know, you because any author, you know, you might have 100, if you're very lucky, you might have 100 5-star reviews, but you don't see those. You go and look at the 1-star reviews. It's just something about human nature. You want to know what the 1-star reviews said. So I learned from that experience not to seek out bad reviews with the next book. I didn't read. I read a couple of the first reviews people wrote, just to sort of see kind of how it was going down, and I do that now. But I don't seek out the bad reviews anymore. I don't go on sites where people review books, because of course they're entitled to their opinion. Of course they're entitled to write a bad review if they didn't enjoy it. That's entirely up to them. But I have the choice to not go and read it. So I think that's the safest place for an author. Don't beat yourself up. We're self-critical enough as it is. Why seek out bad news? If someone sends me a nice review, that's lovely. And most people are kind enough not to tag you into bad reviews. So, I'll just read the nice ones, and then that keeps me happy. I don't seek out the bad reviews. Why bother? Why do that to yourself?
Actually, you have been fortunate that the debut novel, The Chalkman, it became a super duper hit that almost all would have rated it with 5 stars, and very few would have given a kind of a negative criticism. You could have easily set it aside, right?
Yeah, I mean, it did get lots of nice reviews, and it's lovely. And I think, but then, there were bad reviews too. There were people who didn't like it, but, generally it got positive reviews. And, the ultimate for me was that, Stephen King read it and said nice things about it. So for me, that doesn't get any better than that. I was a bit like, well, stuff your 1-star reviews. Stephen King likes it. He's given it a thumbs up. So that was the ultimate for me. And again, that was a dream come true. And I was very fortunate. It was incredible. That it won awards. I was absolutely gobsmacked. I didn't expect any of that. But I think I never do. And I think it's perhaps good to always temper your expectations. I see, now I'm on sort of book 4. I see other, debut authors with books coming out, and it's a lovely thing to, that first book coming out. But I think quite often, you're in a position where you have publishers and agents saying nice things about you and telling you how great it's going to be and how successful. And, hopefully, you're lucky and it is. But I think it's a good idea to sort of always be realistic about things as well. I think because I had so many rejections, I'm always realistic. So I never get my hopes up too much. I just always hope that, people buy the book, they enjoy the book, and it does well enough, and my publishers are happy, and they'll let me keep writing, basically.
CJ and suspense have almost become synonymous and inseparable. Is there a particular approach you follow to bring out the element of suspense in your novels?
Like I said, I'm not a plotter. I like to see where the book goes. And I think in a way that can add to the suspense and to the twist, because I don't know what's going to happen in the book. I'll suddenly have an idea that can completely change the course of the book part way through. And I think that helps in surprising the reader, in keeping them in suspense. The fact that I don't know, and I kind of make it up as I go along. In my last book, I like foreshadowing in books. Where you hint that something's going to happen, but the reader doesn't quite know what. And I do love a good cliffhanger at the end of a chapter. I think you've got to do that, because you want the reader to keep on reading. But in the Burning Girls, my latest book, there's a big twist that I didn't necessarily plan when I started the book, and it only occurred to me probably about halfway through, and I suddenly thought, well, that could be fun. And then I had to go back and kind of rewrite quite a lot of it and put some breadcrumbs in, because that's the other thing you want to do if you're writing a suspense or a mystery, particularly if it's a mystery, it's quite a twisty thriller, is that you don't want readers to ever feel cheated by a reveal or a twist. It has to be something that as a reader you could reasonably guess or spot. Because part of the fun as a reader is kind of going, oh, of course. How did I not see that? It was all there. So, as a mystery sort of writer, that's something, I like to do. The reader should feel involved with it, and you should, take them along on every page, really.
Maybe that suspense connects you with the readers emotionally.
Yeah, I think the other thing, if you're sort of talking about generating suspense or thrills or scares or whatever, is that it goes back to the characters to a degree. You have to have characters that the readers like and want to take the journey with. Because if you have characters that are very cardboard cutout or 2D, who the reader is not invested in, then they don't care about what happens to them. And if you don't care about what happens to the characters, then there is no element of suspense or scare or anything. Because the reader is like, well, I didn't really get that invested in the characters, so I couldn't care less if one of them is killed off by the serial killer in chapter 8. So you've got to have them invested in your characters enough to want to sort of, to be scared for them.
What do you think a writer's life is like? Is it something common like others, or you have your own style of living?
I think, a writer's life is, well, it's different for everybody, I think. Mine is, I always treat it very much as a job as much as I can. But at the moment, that job has to be a bit flexible around everything else that's happening. For me, I just like to get up in the morning, and as soon as I can, I sit down, open the laptop and write. Some mornings that might be first thing, some mornings it might not be till lunchtime at the moment. And I try and just get in as much writing as I can, because I have a commitment to my publishers and, to people who want to read the books. So you've always got to keep that at the forefront. So I think generally a writer's life is not very exciting. It's a lot of sitting there in your slobby clothes, hammering away at the laptop. Some people like to have special routines or special places where they go and write. For me, I can write pretty much anywhere. I do have a writing space in the house, but I'll just as happily sit at the breakfast bar in the kitchen downstairs and write. As long as I've got my laptop, I can write. So I don't have any rituals or routines apart from, cup of tea or coffee. Ultimately, it doesn't matter how you dress it up. At the end of the day, you have to sit there and you have to put words on the page, so whether you want to go to a writing retreat in the Bahamas or up a tree house, or like me, just sit in your slobby clothes at your desk upstairs near the bedroom, you have to get those words on the page. But I think for most writers, it's not it's not sort of a glamorous life, but it's something you like to do. You're wrapped up in your own little world of your own fantasy. You're basically, your job is making stuff up for a living, which is a brilliant job to have.
Have you ever felt that you have compromised a bit of your domestic life for the sake of this professional writing?
It's always a juggling act. I'm a mum. My partner, he also works from home. He produces commercials and he also edits audio books. So he has a home studio downstairs. And particularly at the moment, because, we're in lockdown in the UK and Betty is off school, the schools are all shut. We have to try and juggle homeschooling with work. And that can be difficult. And if you're a mum, you always feel, I don't know, even though it's my job, I'm a working mum, I still feel guilty if I say, I've got to do this work, Betty. I can't do the Lego with you right now. I have to work. So I think there's always a degree of guilt, particularly because she's home more at the moment. When she's at school, it's easier because, she's at school, we can work. But sometimes it's not sort of a regular 9-to-5 job, and when there are deadlines, you have to keep working, early mornings and evenings and things sometimes. So it's a juggling act, and I think all mums, all parents, have to do that juggling act between sort of the domestic life and being a parent and the work life. Whether you work at home, whether you have a job, it's a juggle for everybody. And I think, unless you're extremely lucky and extremely rich and perhaps have servants, then it's something we all have to do.
And I think you have struck the right balance that isn't a kind of an issue anywhere. The balance between the domestic life and your professional writing,
I try. At the moment, so sometimes stuff happens, I'm lucky I've got, my publishers are great and lovely and very understanding. And, we have, everyone has things happen in their life sometimes that means you can't necessarily, focus on work or, commit to work. You have other family commitments and, sometimes, family and things have to take priority. And that's the same for all of us. My family's very important to me. And ultimately, they will always come first if it comes down to it. So I think, it's good that I've got understanding publishers and agents, and I can, if needs be, I can focus on my family. They're always very much, whatever, if you need that time, take that time. But, I don't like letting people down with work or anything. So, it's a compromise and it's a balance. But I feel very fortunate that, I have a great agent. I have great publishers who are also my friends and also care for me and look after me as well. So I feel very lucky.
That's really being fortunate, we should say so. And how did you feel when Stephen King himself recommended your novel, The Chalkman, to his readers? It would have been a fantastic experience. Can you just share a few words about it?
Oh, I always say it was the best day of my life. And then I have to add, apart from meeting my husband and having my daughter, but it was the best day of my life, really. It was just amazing and so unexpected, because we had sent a book to him, but I didn't really think he'd ever get around to reading it, because my goodness, how many books, he must have truckloads of books arrive every day. And I was on the train into London for a meeting, I think. And I just opened my laptop and opened Twitter, and it was the first tweet I saw. And I started reading, he's recommending a book. And then as I read on, I suddenly realized it was my book. And I think I actually stood up and shrieked. I was so excited. It was just one of those absolute dream comes true moments. It really was. He's my absolute hero. And it was amazing. And the thought he'd read the book and he got it. He got sort of the references. It was just a lovely, lovely thing. And I did reply to say thank you so much for the tweet. And I didn't expect him to reply to that. But later I got back to the hotel room, actually, and I saw he had replied, and he just replied and said, "You rock." I was like, oh, Stephen King says I rock. I'm having that on my gravestone.
What else would have made you happier than this comment?
My absolute hero. So it was the most amazing thing. Yeah, incredible.
Okay, and earlier you told that one of your school teachers told that CJ would one day become a prime minister or a best-selling author. But when you were young, what did you think you would be when you grew up? Did you live up to your dream?
I wanted to write. I'd always wanted to do something with writing because it's what I loved. Art and writing. I wasn't so hot on maths. But I think I came from very normal, very average suburban family. With no sort of high aspirations, if that makes sense. So there was always a degree of practicality. So although I wanted to write, I always had the idea that I would have to have a job that involved writing. Being an author seemed something that, I don't know, people who lived in London and in big houses in London got to do, not someone from sort of quite a sort of very average little family in the suburbs. I always thought that I would have to do so. But as I did, I went and worked on the local newspaper. I worked in advertising. I worked at local radio station. I worked at an advertising agency later on. So I always thought that although I wanted to write, my job would have to involve writing, if that made sense. And maybe, I might be able to do some writing on the side as a hobby. But I was always very practical. I would have to do something that paid the bills. I met a lovely college student at an event that I went to, and was talking about writing, and he was talking about writing a book. And both myself and the other author were saying, that's wonderful, but, you will sort of have to get a job to pay the bills. And he was a bit like, what? And I'm like, well yes. Every author has a job to pay the bills while they try and write their bestseller, because that's life, isn't it? So yeah, I always wanted to do something in writing, but I guess I was never sure if I'd ever get published. I knew I wanted to, but if not, then working in the creative industry or in media was what I wanted to do. And I did do that, for a long time, for most of my life, off and on. Mostly I've been sort of self-employed for most of my life in various jobs, which again is I worked out quite early on that I didn't do very well working for companies or working in offices. It just really wasn't me. So, but I quite like the fact I've had quite an eclectic career, because all those different jobs and different experiences all provide good material for the books.
Very few people achieve their goals, and it's really fantastic to know that it's been your dream since your childhood, maybe, and you have proved yourself to be a great writer now. As a celebrity, do you have time for your family and friends? Have you ever regretted being a celebrity?
Oh, I don't think I am. I think that's a nice thing about writing, isn't it? That mostly, even people who write best-selling books, imagine Girl on the Train or Gone Girl, or Stephen King obviously is would know him if they saw him. But even the biggest best-selling authors you could probably walk past on the street. People who've had massive bestsellers, apart from a few sort of top authors, I think. So I think the nice thing is that you can be completely anonymous, really. Even if your books do well, most people won't know what you look like, which is great. And then I still think, I still don't see myself as being, as I suppose, a big author. There's still authors that I look up to who've been doing it for so long, who I think of as, my writing idols. And I just hope I can have such a long career. I think, it's hard to get published, but I think it's actually harder to stay published, because you have to keep delivering the books and people have to keep buying them. And that's the thing you quite soon learn. It's all very well, to have maybe one great big debut that does really well. But, you've got to be consistent, because your publisher will want another great book next year and the year after and the year after that. So actually, learning that and being sort of steady and consistent, I think is the key actually to longevity in publishing.
I keep the expectations high on the part of the readers. You need to maintain your quality, your standard.
Yes, I think that's the thing. You want each book to be better than the last, which is an almost impossible task, really. I mean, it's nice that a lot of people said this is their favourite book, but inevitably there'll probably be some people who it isn't their favourite book, but that's okay too. I think as long as you've done the best you absolutely can. And hopefully people will keep enjoying the books. It's why it's nice to make them different, I think, each time as well. I like the fact that each book, I don't have a sort of a recurring character. Like, it's not a series of books; they're all standalones. So I think that gives you a lot more freedom, actually, to play with, to surprise people, to keep people interested. Even if it's not their favourite of the books you've written, then hopefully they get something out of it if it's different. So, but obviously, pushing yourself to keep that quality up there and to make each book better is one of those things you do. But then that's part of writing, isn't it? You always want to improve on what you've done before.
Writing is actually a creative process. When you enjoy doing it, you feel energized. At times you feel exhausted too. What is your creation process's result actually? You get energized or you get exhausted?
I think it depends, really. For me, actually, I think sometimes the initial getting, I can have like a flow where it's the words are just flowing and you're just hammering the words out and you do feel really energized. You're just getting the words on the page and it's all flowing, and it's just like a manic writing phase. And then sometimes the editing can feel like a bit of a hard slog when you're trying to hone it and make sure it all works and slots together and stuff. And so I sometimes think of the getting the words down, the initial idea. That kind of manic writing phase is kind of the creative part, and then the workmanship, the hard work, comes in the editing. And I like both parts of the process, actually. Sometimes it is tiring. Sometimes with editing you can be a bit like, because the writing phase, I get the original draft down quite quickly, whereas the editing phase, sometimes you're lucky if you do 3 pages in a day. If it's a particularly tricky bit, you just keep rewriting one sentence and changing one word. So that's the real craftsmanship of it, I think, the workmanship part. But that's also necessary. But the exhilaration when you've got a cracking chapter end, or there's a bit that really works, or you have just this great idea. You've been struggling with how to end a chapter or how to resolve something, and suddenly it comes to you. That's hugely satisfying.
Actually, your recent novel, The Burning Girls, I wish it becomes a huge, great success. And we'll be glad to know if you could identify a particular moment that sparked the inspiration behind the writing of that novel, or the most interesting scene that you could talk about to your viewers in the recent novel.
I'm not sure I can pick a particular scene because it's very hard with thrillers without giving anything too much away. Certainly, I mean, I can certainly talk about what inspired it. As I say, when we moved to this very small village where we now live, I saw this very odd-looking chapel on the outskirts of the village, and it wasn't the sort of chapel you'd expect to see in an English village, which tends to be a lot of grey stone, a typical sort of English country church. This was whitewashed and very square. And very plain, and it looked sort of more like the sort of chapel you'd expect to see in a sort of dusty Midwestern American town, very American Gothic. And something about it really spoke to me. Something about it just struck me as creepy. And in front of it, there was a graveyard with lots of old graves, and also this monument, this sort of grey obelisk. And I knew a little bit about the history of the area, but I did a bit more research and found that the monument, and there's quite a few in other small villages around Sussex, was a monument to the Sussex martyrs. In the 16th century, 17 Protestant martyrs were burnt at the stake during Queen Mary's purge of the Protestants. It earned her the name Bloody Mary because she was Catholic and she wanted to convert everyone to Catholic. And the Protestants who refused to convert were persecuted, basically. And, you know, I think there were almost 300 people were burnt at the stake during the course of her reign. And 17 of those were from little villages around this area. And the biggest, as they call it, human bonfire was in a town just up the road called Lewes. And it's something that's commemorated in the area. So there are lots of these little monuments. And every bonfire night, they have huge bonfires and torchlit processions. It actually looks quite like sort of a heathen thing, the huge processions of people carrying flaming torches and flaming crosses to represent the burnt martyrs. So it's a very dark and macabre tradition and a very dark history. And this fascinated me because I thought that, you know, it was something I could use in the book. So in the book, The Burning Girls, in my fictional village, there were martyrs burnt at the stake, 2 of whom were very young girls, and the villagers make these twig dolls called burning girls, and on the anniversary of the burning of the martyrs, these twig dolls are cast into this burning pyre to commemorate the girls who were burnt at the stake. So this little village has this very dark history, and then also sort of in the closer sort of 30 years ago, 2 teenage girls mysteriously disappeared. So when Reverend Jack Brooks and daughter arrive in this small village to take over the parish, they find themselves drawn into this mystery of missing girls and burnt martyrs, and they find that this ancient history and more recent history are somehow entwined. So that was sort of the spark for the book, because I liked the idea of mixing real life events from the past with this fictional story. And also in the book, the burning girls are supposed to appear in the chapel to people who are in trouble. And if you see them, something bad's going to happen. So I sort of took this real life history from the area and then mixed it in to add a really sort of creepy, I suppose, backstory to this mystery and thriller, The Burning Girls. The Burning Girls has lots of different meanings in the book.
So the way you described it, the vivid description that you gave, the tone modulation, we were able to visualize the scene actually.
It's sort of a creepy, it's very much one of my favourite films is a film called The Wicker Man. And I love that kind of small village setting, that kind of folk Gothic horror of a small village and strange traditions and these outsiders coming into it. And that's very much the feel, I think, of The Burning Girls.
That was really fantastic and lively to have you with us, giving a detailed description for each and every question. Do you have anything to share with your fans or viewers through our literal broadcast?
Oh, crumbs. I don't know. I mean, just thank you very much for buying the books and for reading the books. You know, it's so thrilling to sort of know that there are readers sort of all over the world reading the books, which is an amazing thing, you know, from somebody, you know, from a former dog walker in the UK. It still staggers me slightly. And it's a huge privilege and honor that, you know, people are reading them.
That's nice. You're so enthusiastic and lively, and we have planned to bring a new segment with Essential Reads. It's a rapid fire.
Yep.
We are going to shoot questions at you. We expect the answers to be as brief and
Okay,
as candid
sure.
as
Yes.
maybe a single word would do.
Okay.
And you'll have to answer the maximum number of questions. It's just going to be for 60 seconds.
Okay. Right.
So let's go with the segment. What is one thing that you want people to remember about you forever?
Oh, crumbs. Not a bad writer.
What's the weirdest question you have ever been asked?
The last one.
What do you enjoy doing the most?
Sleeping.
If you had to work but didn't need the money, what would you choose to do?
I'd still write.
Describe yourself in a single word.
Disturbingly cheery. Sorry, that's two.
If you are stranded on an island, what two things would you want with you?
My daughter and a lighter to make a fire.
What's one thing a close one of yours taught that completely changed your life?
Sorry, I didn't hear the question. Sorry. It's
What's one thing a close one of yours taught you that completely changed your life?
one thing that completely changed my life, having my book published.
What's the one thing you would like to change about yourself?
My hair. I wish I could grow my hair long.
You did a great job, CJ. You almost answered many questions, but I have a huge list.
I'm so sorry, I wasn't quick enough.
Maybe we'll plan it in such a way that the rapid fire is extended for 5 minutes with such an interesting personality like you.
Oh, thank you. Bless you. Thank you.
So now we'll move on to the questions from the viewers.
Okay.
From our YouTube viewers. So we have a question from Akanksha, Turkey. Isn't no doubt that thriller or horror has always attracted people, but not many movie adaptations of the text are put forth. What could be the hits and misses in it?
In movie adaptations?
Yeah.
I mean, I think obviously, a lot of films have been made of Stephen King's novels. Horror novels. I mean, I think actually we're seeing quite a resurgence of creepy novels being made into sort of films and things at the moment. So I think it's becoming more and more popular. All of my books have been optioned to be made into TV series or films, but possibly TV. So yeah, I hope we sort of see lots more being made. Was the question what I think are hits and misses of books being adapted, or was that the hits and misses of?
1 second. I was just going through the next question. 1 second. It was like not many movie adaptations of the text are put forth. What could be the hits and misses in it?
Hits and misses of the books that hits and misses of the books that have been adapted.
Yeah. Why aren't they adapted?
Why aren't they adapted?
Yeah.
I think more are now. But I think the thing is, it's a strange thing with books. Some adapt very well and work very well, and some just don't hit the mark, and you can never tell. Famously, Stephen King hated the film of The Shining, which most people think is a brilliant film. But I think more creepy books are being adapted now. I think you will see sort of more. I mean, horror's always done really well at the cinema, and I think you will see more sort of creepy things adapted for TV series, because people do have an appetite for it, and there's so many different channels and avenues now for adaptation. Just more, every book seems to be getting optioned to be made into a TV series or film. So, but obviously not all of them will make it to the screen. But, as an author, it'd be interesting to see. I'm sort of, in talks about all 4 of mine. They've all been optioned. Whether one of them will make it to the screen, we shall see.
Thank you, CJ. We have another question from Anusha Hegde. She wants to know how you deal with any writer's block if and whenever they come. How do you deal with any writer's block if and whenever they come?
I'm very lucky in that I've never sort of sat down and gone, oh my goodness, I haven't got any ideas. Normally I've got sort of loads of ideas. I've got them in reserve. So, so far, touch wood, I've been very fortunate. But you do get to, like, as I say, places in the book where you'll get stuck. And, normally I say the best thing is just to write anything, even if it's rubbish, even if you're just hitting keys on the keyboard, it's just breaking that kind of impasse to get writing. And I think if you're stuck for an idea, I think it's like anything. The best thing is to not try and think about it. It's, take yourself away, go for a walk. I go running, just, put your brain in a different space, because those ideas, I think, come best when they come naturally. You can't force a great idea. So, it's like sort of trying not to think of something, take yourself away from it. Don't stare at a blank page. Don't stare at your laptop. Put yourself in a different place and don't stress about it, because, everybody sometimes gets stuck on part of a book or stuck for an idea. So, even if it, takes a few days or more, it will start flowing again. Just, I think sometimes we all find it more difficult than others. And, I think we have to be kind to ourselves and not beat ourselves up if that happens.
CJ, we don't have a question here. It's a comment from one of our viewers. It's P is captain of the Peapods. That's how he has titled himself. I was just looking at your author's page on Goodreads, Miss Tudor. I'm adding the Chalkman to my to be read.
Excellent, thank you.
And another question from Awada Anwar. The question is, what would you say to a newbie author who wants to explore writing the horror genre?
Well, go for it, obviously. I think, it's a good time to be writing in horror right now. Agents are much more open to it. When I started, as I said, it was a bit of a dirty word in publishing, but now, we've seen some great successes for example, Josh Malerman's Bird Box, which was a huge success on Netflix, adapted from a horror novel. There are lots of, horror writers becoming more mainstream. People have got more of a taste for it again. So, get it written, get writing. And then when you do send, your manuscript off, do your research with agents, find out, who represents other horror authors you like, who's open to, receiving horror submissions. Because, I think there is a taste for it again now. So I think it's a good time actually to be writing horror.
We have another question from Mr. Shankar. The question is, in your novel, The Chalkman, the mysterious Chalkman is a terrifying yet mysterious presence. Did Pennywise the dancing clown inspire you in creating a character like the Chalkman?
Not really. I mean, the book has been, a lot of people have compared the book to it. And, I drop in my own hefty Stephen King references in there. But, one of the reasons I think I loved it was because I was, I read it as a child in the 1980s. I was about 12 or 13 at the time. And so I really identified with growing up in a small town and having that little gang of friends, as a lot of kids in the 80s did. And I wanted to write about, my experience of being a teenager. But no, it wasn't. I didn't really write it with it in mind. I wanted to have that flavour of that small town and that gang of friends, getting involved in a very dark mystery that, Stephen King does so well. And I very much wanted it to have a UK setting and a UK feel to it. But in the Chalkman, there isn't really a monster. The Chalkman isn't a monster such as Pennywise, for example. All the things in the Chalkman, although it has a creepy vibe and some events are open to interpretation, kind of all have their resolution in real life. So it's more about an atmosphere than actually having a monster in the Chalk Man.
We have another question from our viewer, Mr. Raj. What other genre do you want to try writing other than the mystery and the thriller genre?
Well, funny you should ask that. My next book is very much in sort of a similar vein to the previous four, but the shiny new idea that I actually had before I was writing this particular book is I've written a few short stories, a couple of short stories of each of them, are kind of sort of more in a sort of, I would call it a post-apocalyptic setting. I find that setting of people being in a slightly different world to ours, where perhaps something bad has happened, quite interesting. And of course, it's always interesting to write about people put in quite desperate situations. So I think I sort of described what will probably be my sixth novel after the next one to a couple of people as a triple locked room mystery set in a mysterious post-apocalyptic future. Which is kind of what it is, really. It sort of has a draft title of Drift. But this is not the book I'm writing next. It'll be the one after that. So it will be something that's a little bit different. There'll still be a mystery. It's still a thriller. There are still elements of horror. There are still sort of elements of suspense. But I wanted to do something a little bit different and quite challenging in that book because of how it's structured. So I think, as I say, as an author and a writer, you're always looking at ways to push yourself and challenge yourself. But I had the idea for that one, and it was just so tempting, the fun that could be had with it, that it has to be written. But it's not the book I'm currently writing. It'll be the one after that. So as I said, I've always got that shiny new idea.
CJ, maybe our viewers are still structuring their questions, but you have already spared your valuable 90 minutes with us. It was exuberant, energetic, lively. We didn't realize 90 minutes have passed. You made it so.
Blimey. Thank you.
It was fantastic being with you.
Thank you very much.
Hope we will be looking forward for your next novel, maybe by the end of 2021 or before it.
So the Burning Girls is this year. The next novel is as yet untitled for 2022, but it has a working title of the 6th. And it is, again, it's kind of a creepy mystery with some sort of supernatural aspects and lots of twists and turns.
Thank you, CJ. Thank you for making the show a great success. Thank you.
Thanks for having me. Thank you.
See you. Bye-bye.
Bye.